October 6, 1941. The Uralmatsensk road lay under a wet grey sky as the first light seeped through birch stands, and the mud sucked at every tread. The air felt heavy. The lead elements of Germany's 4th Panzer Division rattled forward in a narrow column, their Panzer IRAs and IVs crusted with clay. Radio aerials quivering, exhausts coughing sweet petrol into the cold. They were confident. Scouts waved them on past ruined farmsteads and burned wagons as the drizzle turned the verge into a brown river, track pins glittering with gritty water. No ambush was expected. Then, from the tree line to the east, something moved with a low iron rumble, not the high whine of German engines, but a deeper, diesel-bellied growl that carried through the birches like distant thunder. Everyone felt it. Olive, drab hull slid into view. Armour plates angled like a breaker's edge, wide tracks shouldering aside the mud. The alien Soviet crosses barely visible beneath grime. They looked wrong. T-34 lurched forward and stopped broadside in the reeds, its cast turret squatting low, the 76.2 mm 34 gun turning with unhurried certainty toward the road. It wasn't afraid. German drivers hit brakes and slewed left, fenders cutting furrows, while commanders popped hatches and pointed, the practiced choreography of battle suddenly jerking out of rhythm. Surprise drew breath. First shots cracked from the column, 37-milers and short 50-mile of rounds snapping out, tracers biting sparks from the T-34's sloped glisis and ricocheting high in bright, cruel curves over the field. Nothing bit. The Soviet gun spoke once. A concussive thud that swallowed distance, and a Panzer artillery lurched as if kicked in the chest, its hull ringing like struck iron and its turret housing filling with smoke. Men bailed. Fewer. German gunners screamed through masks and throat mics, hosing AP shells that skittered off at angles, bright flakes running down the Soviet armour like rain on slate. Panic whispered. A second T-34 nosed out of the birch trunks, saplings snapping under the track shoes, and both machines began to walk fire down the column, as if stepping through a drill they had practiced in the dark. The method was cold. Crewmen strained to bring an 8.8 cm flak gun off its limber at the roadside, hands black with wet rope, wheels half buried, an NCO splashing ahead to sight by hand, because the aiming posts were lost in the muck. Time bled away. Over the radio net, clipped German words collided with static, call signs, ranges, fragments of the word T-34, as if naming it could make it mortal. It did not. Inside one of the Soviet tanks, the diesel heat hummed, the turret basket creaked, and the gunner leaned into the sight, his breath fogging the glass while the loader slammed another 76 into the breech with a gloved palm. They worked like a piston. On the road, a Panzer IV fired its stubby 75 Mannenef, and the shell burst shallow on the T-34's front plate, a bright flower of sparks that faded to nothing against the armour's deliberate angles. Hope evaporated. Machine gun bursts stitched the tree line and shook wet leaves down in whispers, while the Soviet tracks churned forward, wide cleats gripping the sludge that swallowed lighter vehicles to the hub. Weight was will. A corporal dragged a comrade from a hatch, boots sliding in clay, the man's voice high and oddly quiet, as he coughed smoke and mud in equal measure. The line buckled. Somewhere behind, an officer shouted for flanking fire, for grenades, for the 88 to bear, for any answer that mattered. There was silence between the words. A second German shell found the T-34's side at a shallow angle and glanced away with a harsh wheeze, vanishing into the fields, while the Soviet gun turned fractionally and cut the road again with a single flat roar. Shock became weight. Heinz Guderian would later write, "The T-34 was superior to our tanks," the sentence plain and metallic on the page like a rivet hammered home. The truth had arrived. Birch bark tore and fluttered as splinters under fire. The smell of hot diesel and damp earth, mixing with the sweet burns of propellant that drifted low along the verge. Senses blurred. From the tree line the Soviet formation split, one T-34 pressing the road, the other ghosting along the embankment to rake the column from an angle that textbooks loved but panic denied. Text met reality. A German round finally found purchase, punching into the T-34's track guard and collapsing a section of links, the tank slewing, hull grating. Turret steady even as the road shook beneath it. It did not stop firing. A panzer commander ducked, eyes full of rain and grit, as his headset chattered. The word, "Tu Reklopfer," muttered darkly by a gunner who had watched too many 3.7 CMEV hits do nothing. Jokes died fast. In that wet corridor of October, arrogance drained with the runoff, replaced by a harder understanding that settled in like cold under a coat. Fear changed doctrine. The 8.8 finally cracked, the sound cutting the morning in a clean white line, and an armour plate on the far T-34 puckered and split, the tank shouldering on in stubborn, wounded fury. Even victory cost. When the Soviet machines withdrew, as suddenly as they had come, the road smoked and hissed, and the birches hung with torn cloth like flags surrendered to the rain. The column was not the same. General Ewald von Kleist would call it the best tank in the world. A judgment born not in a laboratory, but on roads like this, written in mud and shrapnel. Respect replaced laughter. The moment passed with the hiss of cooling metal and the soft slap of rain on steel, leaving the Ural-Mtsensk road to remember how underestimation turned to thunder. The joke had learned to roll through their lines. June 25, 1941. 3 German army groups broke the border at dawn, their maps inked with straight arrows and short timetables that promised a quick decision in the east. Confidence rode on steel. Army Group Center drove for Smolensk and then Moscow, its spearheads, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd, laced with Panzer Arthurios, J tanks and short-barreled Panzer IVF-1s, the radios crisp. The columns drilled to the minute. They believed speed would decide all. Across the frontier, the Red Army reeled under the first week's blast. Mechanized corps shattered, fuel dumps burning, and command posts lifted from their dugouts by Stuka sirens. It looked like collapse. German crews expected more of the same thin-skinned T-26 and BT-7As to be flanked and finished, road-bound armour to be herded by doctrine and nerve. They underestimated the new shape in the smoke. By late June, front line reports began to change tone. Phrases about new types, with sloped plates, wide tracks, and a gun that punched above its caliber. Doubt crept in. General Franz Halder noted in his diary that the Russians had introduced tanks against which existing anti-tank weapons proved inadequate. Units asked for 8.8 cm guns by name. The request felt urgent. Those new types were the T-34 and its heavier companion, the KV-1, appearing not as a wave, but as stubborn knots that resisted encirclement and then punched out of it. They refused to behave. Still, the plan drove forward. Smolensk, Yelnya, Vyazma, until at the beginning of October the operation code, named Typhoon, aimed a final thrust at Moscow. The panzers lunging along the Ural-Mtsensk, Tula axis under a sky that threatened rain. Time was the enemy as much as the Red Army. The Soviet side, reorganizing under fire, had dissolved its shattered mechanized corps and raised leaner tank brigades with mixed equipment. Among them stood Colonel Mikhail Katyukov's 4th Tank Brigade with T-34s and a handful of KV-1s. It was small, but it could bite. Moscow needed days. Rail lines to clear, reserves to move, factories to shift east. And the only coin available in early October was mud, trees, and the shock of an ambush. Every hour mattered. The Wehrmacht's edge at this stage was method radios in every tank, combined arms choreography, and gunners who could range and fire on instinct, supported by the 3.7mm PaK-36 and the newer 5mm PaK-38 anti-tank guns along the roads. They trusted procedure to overcome surprises. But that slim-nosed 3.7 was already earning the front-line nickname T-34, door knocker, after crews watched its rounds spark and slide from sloped Soviet armor. Soviet strengths wore different clothes. The T-34's sloped 45 MAV Glatsis 76.2 mm F-34 gun, and a torquey V2 diesel that kept its wide tracks, grinding through muck that trapped lighter machines, even as crews wrestled with poor visibility and overworked commanders in two-man turrets. It was a brutal balance sheet. German aerial dominance had been decisive in summer, but low cloud and lengthening supply lines dulled the Luftwaffe's edge as typhoon began, leaving ground columns to sort surprises with whatever they hauled. Weather turned advantage into guesswork. At Ural and Mitsensk, the geography shrank the fight. Birch stands, river crossings, choke point bridges. Perfect places for a tank brigade to lie close and cut the road with sudden, flat-voiced fire. The map funneled momentum into risk. Guderian's 4th Panzer Division led the thrust, Panzer Regiment 35 at its heart. With motorized infantry, including infantry, Regiment Gross-Deutschland strung along the wet verges, orders crisp and fuel low. They had outrun certainty. On the Soviet side, Katukov set his brigade not as a blunt wall, but as a series of bites. Forward scouts to fix, hold down guns to bleed, and reserve tanks to hammer the stalled head of the column. Ambush became doctrine in real time. In Berlin and at Kummersdorf, evaluators would soon strip captured T-34s and write reports for Warpref 6 praising sloped armor, diesel safety, and track layout while condemning optics and crew ergonomics. On paper, admiration cooled into engineering notes. At the front, the language was simpler. The T-34 was superior to our tanks, Guderian admitted, and General Ewald von Kleist called it the best tank in the world. Both sentences pressed into the war's ledgers before the snow fell. Respect had been forced at gunpoint. This mattered because Typhoon's clock ticked in weeks, and every stalled column meant a day lost to mud, to refuel, to pull a gun free by hand while the Red Army dug a little deeper along Moscow's approaches. Delay was a weapon. Both sides brought their faith. Germany in the rehearsed geometry of combined arms, the Soviet Union in the grim will to trade space for time and spend steel to buy a winter. Belief met the unforgiving road. In that meeting, the T-34 changed from rumour to premise, a machine that altered how men looked at distance and cover and the value of a shallow ditch. It rewrote expectations. The Ural-Mitsensk road became more than a line on Guderian's map. It was a test strip where sloped armour met short guns in sleet, where brigade tactics born of necessity cracked a timed advance. The lesson printed itself in mud and smoke. By the time the panzers edged past Mitsensk, the Wehrmacht's certainty had sloughed away in brown sheets, and the Red Army had discovered in ambush and counterstroke a way to slow the invader without air or numbers. The stage was set for a long, grinding argument of steel. A wet wind carried diesel fumes through the birches as staff cars idled and runners trotted, and on both sides the smell of damp canvas and hot oil became the scent of a campaign that would not end by the first snow. The set-up closed with rain on steel and a promise of harder days ahead. The T-34 began as a contest of ideas at Kharkov's Factory No. 183, where Mikhail Koshkin and his successor Alexander Morozov pushed the A-20 and A-32 prototypes toward a new template for war. It was purpose-forged. Christie suspension with big, road-dominating wheels let the hull float over ruts that would break a truck's spine, the top run of track sagging without rollers and smearing its own path into the mud. It rode like a brawler. Under the engine deck, the V2 was a 12-cylinder, 38.8-litre diesel that made roughly 500 horsepower at 1,800 rpm, turning torque into motion even when the road dissolved. The heartbeat was heavy and sure. Diesel fuel cut the flash risk that haunted gasoline, burning German tanks, and the engine's low end pull held traction when the ground tried to swallow steel. Fire feared it more than it feared fire. Armour carried a new geometry. 45 mm on the glacis sloped at about 60 degrees from vertical, side plates around 40 mm, and a turret face near 52 mm, turning incoming shot into glancing sparks by shape as much as by thickness. Angles made defiance. A cast or welded 2-man turret sat on a narrow 142-metre ring, its arcs curved and coarse, the commander doubling as gunner behind the F-34 706.2 Leons. Power met compromise. That F-34 threw an AP round around 660 less and a blunt-nosed HE shell that broke bunkers and timber. Its BR-350A punching through medium armour at battle ranges that mattered. It hit harder than it looked. Early crews stared through the TO-6 telescope and PT-4-7 periscopes that fogged in winter and swam with dust in summer, and many tanks rolled to war without radios the 71 TK-3 sets hoarded for leaders. Eyes and voices were scarce. Inside, the gearbox was an enemy of wrists, a 4-speed crash box that needed a hammer's persuasion, while the clutch and final drives punished any mistake with smoke and silence. It was strong, not gentle. Air filters hated dust, and let grit chew the cylinders until later fixes arrived, and the loader shouldered shells in a space that felt like a cast iron well. Endurance cost skin, yet the tracks, wide, rough, over half a metre, bit into clay and snow that turned German rubber, tired road wheels slick as soap, and ground clearance let the whole climb the very verge that trapped others. Mobility became a weapon. On the other side of the sights, Panzer Thuos, J models Fiebelteltrad Kauke 38-42 at first, later the longer Elf-60, while Panzer IVF-1s carried the short 7.5 cm's KK-37, whose low velocity punch was meant for infantry, not sloped plate. Guns met their limits. Pak-36 anti-tank guns, 3.7 mm door knockers, rang uselessly on the T-34's nose, and even the 5 cm Pak-38 needed tungsten, cord plaguesack of 40 and good luck with angles to do work forward of 300-500 metres. Ricochet became a sound of dread. The 8.8 cm mid-flak 18-36 cut through at range and became the emergency answer, cartwheeled off its limber by sweating crews who knew that anything less would be prayer. Necessity learned speed. German doctrine still shone. Radios in every tank, practiced fire, and manoeuvre with panzer grenadiers, and a habit of flanking to hit from 30 or 40, 5 degrees where slope stopped saving. Method hunted weakness. Soviet doctrine adapted in blood. Tank brigades fought in knots, ambushing from hull down folds, holding fire until 300-600 metres to make the F-34's math simple, then slipping away before artillery and Stukas could answer. Survival became art. Tu Raklopfer. German crews muttered about the little pack, as sparks jumped from the T-34's glacis, and Halder's diary admitted the point. Existing anti-tank weapons were inadequate against the new Russian tanks. Recognition entered the logbooks. The T-34's character showed as much in silence as in raw mud, lapped skirts, exhausts blowing white in cold dawn. A turret that turned with deliberate weight, while the driver felt his way by hands and hips. It moved like a work animal that refused to tire. Where German optics were crisp Zeiss glass, and turret ergonomics cleanly divided among 3 men, the Soviet machine asked one man to command and aim and another to feed and fight, a human tax paid for steel and speed. Brains ran hot while engines ran steady. Numbers told one truth, roughly 26-28 tons, 500 horses, sloped 45 mammoth that behaved like far more, and a gun that killed everything it could catch in its envelope. Texture told the rest. Engineers at Kummersdorf would strip a captured T-34 and praise the slope and track layout while frowning at cramped crew spaces, and crude finishing, their pencils scratching quietly toward the shapes that would become Panther. The ledger balanced in steel. In doctrine, the Red Army learned to let the terrain speak. Birch lines for cover, soft verges for traps, short sight lines to erase German range and magnify diesel confidence. Distance was a decision, not a given. And in the sum of metal and method, the T-34's personality hardened into a single idea that could be felt through the whole floor, and the gunner's cheek on frozen glass. It was built to survive long enough to kill. October 6, 1941, the Zusha River cut a slow, brown seam below Metsensk, as mist hung in the birches, and the Ural road glistened with ruts like wounds that wouldn't close. The trap tightened. Katyukov's 4th Tank Brigade sat in the folds, engines idling low behind berms and felled trunks, scouts down in the reeds, KV-1s hulled down like iron stumps. T-34s crouched where the slope broke the line of sight. They would not blink. Down the road came Panzer, Regiment 35 of 4. Panzer Division, a practiced blade. Armoured points leading, half, tracks tucked close, Gross Ditchland's motorised infantry rippling, in the rear guard like a second wave. They expected to cut through. The first contact was a rumour of diesel from the tree line, a dark, rolling note beneath the sharp clatter of Maybach engines, and then a gun flash like a camera bulb at a funeral. The film started with a hit. An F-34 round smashed the lead Panzer Arthur in the chest, spun it sideways, and jammed the column in an instant, the road turning from highway to funnel as drivers saw only steel and mud, and nowhere to go. Momentum died in mud. German gunners threw 3.7 cms and 5 cm rounds on command, tracers zipping flat and angry into 45 Malasers of sloped armour that answered with showers of sparks and the cold refusal of geometry. Ricochet became a verdict. On the brigade net, short phrases stacked like bricks, ranges, bearings, corrections, an order to hold until 300 metres, and then to fire for effect. The loaders' gloves going black with propellant, as shells thumped home. Discipline felt like breath. The T-34 was superior to our tanks. Heinz Guderian would write, his sentence as clipped and hard as the ricochet rings that day above the Zusha. Recognition had a sound. Panzer Grenadiers spilled off the verges and dug for cover. Pak 36 teams muscling their TLU Reklopfer into position between the birch trunks. The little guns coughing and ringing the Soviet glacis with harmless metal rain. Courage met physics. A KV-1 shouldered up from a hollow and laid a 76 Monioros round down the road with the last word of a judge, while the T-34 slid laterally, using the ground like a second armour to keep only their guns and angles exposed. Tactics wore steel faces. Halder's diary would catch the tone within weeks. Existing anti-tank weapons were inadequate against the new Russian tanks. And on this road the fact wrote itself across wrecks and wheel tracks. Paper trailed reality. German crews adapted on instinct. The smoke pots popped. A flank detachment went looking for side shots through the birches, and runners sprinted back down the column, shouting for the 8.8 to come up. Procedure learned fear. Katyukov shifted by feel, sending 2 T-34s to rake the road from a crossing fire, holding the KV back for counterpunch, and ordering his tanks to back off a few metres between shots so German rangerfinders kept losing the line. He boxed with distance. A Panzer Holothur with the longer 5 cm LL-60 tried the angle and scored a shallow bite on a T-34's side plate, paint and pride torn, but nothing inside hurt. The Soviet driver answered by lifting a ridge and slewing to present only slope. Experience outweighed inches. Crewmen on the flak 88 finally clawed their gun, through the muck to a hard patch. The NCO sighting along the barrel, as if peering through a pipe at fate, and the first 8.8 cm's round punched straight and unarguable. Silence followed impact. The hit dimpled deep into a T-34's turret cheek and tore iron out the far side in a hot scream. the tank still firing as if momentum itself were a duty. Smoke streaming, loader coughing, gunner blind but steady on the hand wheel. Even wounds had orders. A Soviet report from the brigade that week recorded the method in plain words. Fire from ambush, short range, rapid displacement. Use of reverse slopes and maskings. Its syntax as lean as the birch trunks that hid them. Doctrine was born under fire. German machine. Gun belts ran hot stitching the tree line, mortars thumped, and the road heaved with shouted ranges and clanging hatches. Yet the angles continued to betray them, front plates rejecting what summer had taught them to trust. Summer rules had expired. When the Soviet tanks slipped gear and fell back 100 meters, they did it together. A low iron tide sliding into a second crease of ground, where fresh fields of fire waited, periscopes blinking like lizard eyes above wet grass. Ambush became a rhythm. Guderian rode forward in his command half, Traken watched the four. Panzer. Division wrestled the road open a meter at a time, losses tollying in reports that read dry but felt heavy. Time lost, fuel burned, crews shaken. Delay was victory spelled slowly. Best tank in the world. General Ewald von Kleist would call it. And on this day that title was earned not in a parade but in the stutter and grind of a stalled offensive gnawing at its own timetable. Words caught up with mud. By afternoon the 88s had a corridor and the panzers began to peel past the wrecks, cautious, angry, their commanders measuring every hedgerow as if it had teeth, while Katukov's brigade slid away into new folds like wolves changing cover. A lesson had been delivered. The gun camera's twin, after-action reports, captured the brutal arithmetic, several panzers knocked out, others crippled, hours gone, morale dented by the sight of rounds skidding off a front plate that should have yielded. Shock put numbers on paper. When dusk closed over Mitsensk, the smoke tasted sour and the road shone with oil, slicked puddles that reflected the thin daylight like blind eyes, the birches shaken clean of leaves by concussion. Belief had been stripped the same way. A final Panzer III tried to rush the gap and died to one flat, voiced shot that turned its turret sideways like a child's toy, crew doors banging open to spill men into the wet ditch. The column stared at physics made visible. No one on either net laughed about the door knocker anymore, and even as the division pressed on in days to come, the memory of sloped iron shrugging off doctrine hung over every briefing. Arrogance had met reality. Out there on the Zusha, as the mist settled again and diesel thrum faded into the trees, the T-34 had written a new rule in brown water and broken steel. The 109 never split, but the old assumptions did. Winter 1941-42 froze lessons into doctrine as snow welded itself to the hulls and breath turned to frost inside turrets. The Mitsensk shock rippling outward along staff lines and training grounds. The fear acquired a procedure. On German ranges from Die Beritz to Kummersdorf, officers chalked new diagrams, angles, weak spots, and flanking arrows, while pamphlets warned crews to avoid frontal duels with T-34s and to call up the 8.AS or the newer 7.5 Siebens Pak-40. They stopped pretending the door knocker would do. Franz Halder's diary had already set the tone. The Russian T-34 and KV tanks present us with a very serious problem. A sentence that moved from a private page into the orders of entire armies. Doubt became policy. By spring 1942, countermeasures arrived on trucks. The 7.5 Sia Pak-40 with APC-BC rounds at roughly 790 meters per second and tungsten APCR screaming faster, Stukel assault guns rammed with long 7.5 mm Stuck 40s, and Panzer IVF-2s carrying the KK-40L-43. New teeth bit back. At 800 meters and in, those long 7.5s could break a T-34's front with careful aim. And from the flank they punched cleanly, gun smoke rolling low as loaders' gloves burned with cordite. Range felt like revenge. Soviet factors answered with blunt force, More T-34s, better finished and slightly refined, the 4-speed crash box giving way to a 5-speed. Air filters improved so engines stopped eating dust. External fuel drums riding like tin canteens on the hull. Quantity learned precision. The turret evolved into the hexagonal nut. Welded in rough facets. Twin circular hatches opening like ears. Mickey Mouse. To German infantry. Visibility modest but survivable. Radios spreading through platoons instead of hiding in headquarters. Communication grew teeth. Field orders on both sides tightened. German tankers drilled for side shots and called fire onto track links and turret rings, while Soviet brigades codified ambush, reverse, slope fighting, and a deadly 300-600 meter engagement envelope. Experience hardened into rhythm. Do not fight the T-34 frontally. A battalion instruction read in dry ink. Engage flanks, immobilize, destroy with 8.8 or 7.5 cm. Caution learned its own language. On the Don and at the approaches to Stalingrad, Stugs lay in wheat stubble with barrels level and patient, waiting to pick the T-34s off as they crossed ridgelines, their sights full of grey-green slope and moving track teeth. Ambush answered ambush. Inside Soviet turrets, commanders still doubled as gunners, but their loaders learned a cadence. Shell, slam, sight, while Tanko Desantniki clung to engine decks with grenades and PPS drums, ready to leap off and kill the guns that killed their tanks. The machine carried infantry like a clenched fist. German infantry learned new shapes of fear. Hafthorladung magnetic charges slapped to plates, smoke grenades to blind optics, Panzerbuch case rifles stepping aside for Panzerstreck and Panzerfaust as 1943 drew near. Front lines grew teeth and thorns. In staff meetings, another answer took shape on paper. VK 30.02 the Panther sloped like the enemy it feared along 7.5 cm and Keb K-42 promised to outrange the T-34. Transmission and final drives still a question mark scrawled in pencil. Imitation smelled like cold oil and hope. Guderian's earlier admission. The T-34 was superior to our tanks. Now stood beside a different sentence in unit logs. Panzer IV, long, effective. A sober counterweight that made crews breathe easier when the horizon glittered with low silhouettes. Relief came with a new muzzle flash. But the Soviets were not standing still. They were learning the cost of outgunning without out-seeing, and engineers at Ural factories widened the path to a 3-man turret with a 1.6-meter ring. The T-34-85's future traced in soapstone on shop floors. A new head was being cast for the same body. On the southern steppe through 1942, German gunners called ranges and folded T-34s at distance, while Soviet brigades answered with mass. Companies surging in echelons, smoke curling, guns firing on the move, tracks throwing straw and earth like spray. Pressure replaced finesse. A4. Panzer Division after action note in that year sounded clinical. Front plate of T-34 resists 3.775 cm except at close range, long 7.5 cm did satisfactory attack from flanks recommended. Mines effective on tracks. Precision hid the memory of ricochets. By early 1943, the word Kursk drew lines on maps and sweat on brows. Both sides rushing their answers to the same problem. Germans fielding Panthers and Tigers. Soviets thickening belts with mines, guns, and T-34s stacked nose to tail behind camouflage nets. Everyone expected the sky to crack. German crews whispered that the long 7.5 had levelled the duel, then looked over hedgerows and saw the number of silhouettes, felt the ground tremble as battalions rolled, and understood the duel had multiplied. Parity met mass. Soviet commanders wrote it plainly in orders: close the distance, attack in platoons, exploit gaps with speed and smoke, keep artillery on the move, and accept losses that bought ground and time. Resolve sounded like steel tapping steel. When Panthers first drove, many broke themselves on their own gears and in that mechanical stutter the T-34s found lanes 76 mm guns barking, and then falling back. Diesel cough trailing black threads across the wheat. Reliability made courage possible. German infantry started to speak of T-34 fear, the way aviators spoke of flak curtains, a pragmatic superstition born of watching shells skid off a nose and of counting how many friends it took to bring one down. Dread learned a silhouette. In workshops east of the Urals, the T-34-85's turret took its final shape, the D-5T first. Then the Zayas 53-85 Manevras gun, giving a commander his own seat, and a gun with reach enough to argue with cats named after cats. A voice returned to the turret. By the time spring thaws came again, adaptation had written itself into every bolt and briefing. Pak-40s at crossroads, Schuh-Ursen hanging like aprons on Panzer IVs against anti-tank rifles, T-34s wearing spare track on their cheeks like scars. Technology became a vocabulary of survival. Men on both sides stopped laughing when a low diesel rumble rolled over a ridge and only started breathing when long 7.5s answered with their sharper crack, smoke thick as cloth holding the shape of fear between them. The war had learned the T-34's name and spoken back. Summer 1944 opened with the rumble of thousands of V-2 diesels as the Red Army's fronts drew deep arrows across Belarus for Operation Bagration, roads shimmering with heat and dust under the marching weight of steel. The balance finally tipped. Tank armies, First Guards under Katukov, Second Guards under Bogdanov, stacked T-34-85 as nose to tail behind camouflage nets, while sappers blew gaps and Katyushas softened strongpoints with a rain that smelled of cordite and sap. Mass became method. The machine had changed its face, a new 3-man turret on a 1.6-meter ring, commander in his own cupola with all-around vision blocks, an 85mm SS-53 pushing armour, piercing shot fast enough to bite Panzer IVs frontally at range. A voice returned to the turret. Hull armour still sloped at 60 degrees over 45 maniams, and the running gear still floated on Christie springs, but radios, 9RS sets, now spoke across platoons, and coordination replaced shouting through open hatches. Orders travelled as fast as fear. On the Minsk highway, lead elements fanned into Klin, wedge formations, 1 point, 2 shoulders, then the rest in depth, guns elevated for speed, hatches cracked for air, infantry riding tankodesant on the decks like clenched bristles. The shape of advance was a blade. German rear guards blinked into the dust cloud and found silhouettes everywhere, long 7.5s and 8.As answering where they could. Panzerfaust teams crouched behind doors and culverts and waiting for the 50-meter rush. Bravery narrowed to alley length. Gun crews had their counters ready. Pak-40s at crossroads. Stugiveri's hull down in wheat stubble. Tiger is anchoring company fronts, but the pressure of timing and numbers bent their lines like a sapling in flood. Resistance felt small. Bagration statistics told a cold story. German army group center shattered, hundreds of thousands lost, and Soviet armor and mechanized corps driving 300-600 kilometers in a month with repair trucks and fuel columns snapping at their heels. An avalanche of steel moved with hunger. Inside a T-34-85, the routine clicked. Loader hand to ready racks, gunner calling, distance. 600. Commander scanning through the cupola. Driver short, shifting the 5. Speed to keep torque high and engine temp honest. Everything served the next shot. The 85 Mamavra's gun spat with a harder, flatter voice. APCBC rounds clanging through Panzer IV glacis at the kilometre mark and biting panthers from the flank when wedge tactics and smoke made angles appear like doors. Range no longer belonged to one side. German infantry described the sound in letters. First a ground, shaking murmur, then a hammering on cobbles, then the hollow ringing of steel as grenades, and magnet charges sought track and hatch. The approach played in the bones. Belarusian villages saw the choreography turn lethal and intimate T-34s nosing past Esbaz, coaxial DTs stitching shutters, infantry peeling off the decks to clear cellars, while the tanks reversed to avoid Panzerfaust, cones flaring like sunsets at street ends. Domination demanded caution. In Poland that autumn and on the Vistula in winter, tank armies rested under pine boughs with snow packed over engine decks, then burst forward in the Vistula-Oder offensive, up to 500 kilometers in 3 weeks. Bridges seized, towns outflanked, fuel Bowsers chasing the advance like faithful dogs. Momentum became mercy to those who wanted the war finished. T-34 85s were not invulnerable. Tigers and Panthers took a toll at range, and Panzerstreck gunners burned machines at 30 meters in courtyards where echoes hid the shot. Dominance was paid in crew names etched on turret rings, but reliability and quantity meant the column kept its shape. Broken tracks swapped in minutes, engines swapped in hours, spare links welded to cheeks, and replacement crews climbing into warm seats with faces stiff and quiet. The machine never fought alone. Artillery marched with it, Su-76 and Su-85 assault guns on the flanks, Zis-3s bucking in fields, Guards' mortars sliding fire ahead, and Il-2 Szytermowics stitched roads with RS rockets, turning German movement by day into a rumour. Combined arms stitched the battlefield tight. Urban fights showed the two faces of the T-34's ruled in Budapest, and then Berlin. Tanks led the first shove and bled for it, then learned to let sappers and submachine gunners go first while they watched corners and punished muzzle flashes. Experience had a cost and a cure. A Berlin block in April 1945 became a geometry lesson. One tank covering, one crossing, one watching roof lines, while the 85 Manamevs cracked floors open and the turret MG mowed attic loopholes until the street lay quiet under dust and falling plaster. Precision replaced bravado. German reports called it tank terror, when companies froze under simultaneous armour, mortar, and machine gun pressure. The T-34s always present, even when only their smoke and track prints showed on the paving stones. Presence became a weapon by itself. For crews, the apex felt like exhaustion wrapped in routine. Swap a bogey wheel, clean the carbon from the injector nozzles, write the dead into the log, and mount up when the sergeant clapped twice on the glacis. Victory smelled like diesel and grief. By the time Soviet flags climbed Reichstag stone, the T-34 85 had carried brigades across nations, over 50,000 T-34s built by war's end, most of them in the fight, and it ended where it began, point forward. Engine hot, gun blackened to chalk. The ground belonged to the shape that refused to stop. Night over Nizhny Tagil burned orange, as open hearth furnaces licked the snow, and the clatter of riveting mixed with the rhythm of stamping presses in halls that never darkened. Industry learned to march. In the last months of 1941, more than 500 plants and design bureaus rode east on flat cars. Kharkov's factory No. 183, Leningrad's Kirov works, chunks of Stalingrad's tractor plant, bolted down beside crates of gauges and sleeping families. Chaos became relocation. By early 1942, Uralvagonzavodtsova Factory No. 3rd in Nizhny Tagil STZ's remnant lines and Factory No. 112, Krasnoye Sormovo, in Gorky hammered the T-34 into a product as much as a weapon. Welding jigs replacing hand, fit seams and stamped wheels replacing time-hungry castings. Simplicity bred speed. The V2 diesel, born in Kharkov, flowed from dispersed engine plants at Chelyabinsk and Barnaul, its 12 cylinders milled by machine tools that arrived in Lend, lease crates stenciled in English and packed with oiled paper. Foreign hands fed a Soviet heartbeat. Everything for the front. Everything for victory! Posters shouted over the assembly lines as women and teenagers took stations, sledge, hammering track pins, riding cranes, and chalking inspection marks that dried white on green paint. The slogan became muscle. Man-hours per tank fell by more than half between 1941 and 1943 as weld seams straightened, armor plates standardized, and the hexagonal turret's facets slipped into place like folded paper. Efficiency turned into armor. Dozens of T-34s a day crawled off the lines at peak, engines coughing, radios tested with a curt burst of static, road wheels bouncing on test tracks covered with frozen cinders until the suspension groaned like a living thing. Quantity felt like thunder. Boxcars took them east, to west in stair-step movements, depot to front, depot to corpse railhead, where, or Rembats, mobile repair battalions, stripped derelicts for parts, straightened fenders with sledges, and sent the best back to the line with chalked dates on their hulls. Nothing was wasted. The supply web thickened, 76.2 Amerim crates stacked like bricks, diesel in drums, tow cables coiled like snakes, spare links welded to turret cheeks, and Allied trucks, especially Studebaker US-6, hauling ammunition and men across roads that would have broken hoof and axle. Logistics turned mass into motion. Where 1941 crews learned on the march, 1942-43 crews drilled in Omsk, Ulyanovsk and Nizhny Tagil schools with cutaway gearboxes, firing tables tacked to walls, and range days rationed by fuel, weeks of instruction replacing days. Training finally had a clock. Franz Halder's diary, July 1904, had confessed the first truth. We underestimated the enemy. But the second arrived in freight tonnage as German staffs watched fresh Soviet brigades appear faster than maps could be redrawn. Realization weighed like steel. On the gun line, Plant No. 92 under VG Graben delivered the ZS-5385 Maras by late 1943. Its clean recoil and reliable breech married to the T-34 85's new 3-man turret, while Plant No. 9's D-5T armed early batches like a promise already kept. Firepower followed the rail schedule. German answers had sharp edges. Panther programs, improved Panzer IV lines, Stug output rising under Speer, but complexity taxed time, and tungsten shortages throttled APCR rounds just as Soviet armor thickened and multiplied. The calendar betrayed precision. Fuel and crews became the Wehrmacht's constraint. Training hours were cut, maneuvers trimmed to conserve gasoline, and experienced NCOs disappeared into the casualty lists as replacements arrived with eyes wide and hands unsure on traverse wheels. Skill could not be machined. By 1944, the Soviet front lived on a tide of deliveries. Replacement battalions riding west with tanks fresh from paint booths, 85mm ammo sealed in waxed paper, pioneer tools clanging as trains braked into forest sidings at night. An army learned to drink from its own river. In factory yards, inspectors ticked forms by the light of carbide lamps, stamping acceptance marks into glacis plates that had been rolled thinner but smarter. Angles doing the work of inches, while new cupolas sprouted vision blocks like facets of a gemstone. Design served production, and production served the front. Stalingrad's ruin had not ended STZ's lineage. Its presses reappeared in the Urals like transplanted organs, and soon after Bagration the 85 Mum lead flow rose again. Brigades re-equipped in days rather than weeks, their old 76 relegated to reserves or passed to Allies. Continuity survived rubble. German reports from shattered regiments read sparse and tired. Tank strengths halved, ammunition short, orders to withdraw to shorter lines, typed without sentiment, while Soviet depots chalked numbers on hulls and sent them forward, the pencil strokes as calm as weather forecasts. One side counted loss, the other counted dispatches. The avalanche of steel was not blind. It moved with spare parts catalogues, with field modifications standardized in circulars, with repair trains that carried engine blocks and turret rings beside bread and boots. Organization gave the avalanche steering. On a winter platform in 1945, a young commander stepped into a brand, new T-34 85, traced the embossed factory mark with a gloved thumb. and listened to the V2 catch on the second crank, while the yard smelled of coal smoke and primer. He knew he would not wait long to fight. Behind him, the foundries breathed, the rails hummed, and the papers in the traffic office charted a simple truth that had become strategy. As long as the moulds were filled and the signals turned green, the front would never run out of T-34s. Industrial thunder had found its voice. In the cool light of Kabinka's hangars and Bovington's galleries, a T-34 stands behind a rope, green paint dulled by decades, track shoes resting on concrete like a sleeping animal that once shook continents. The myth sits still. A small placard lists its truths: T-3476 model 1942 or T-3485 2632 tons across variants, V2 diesel at roughly 500 horsepower, 45 mm glacis sloped to cheat angles, a 3476.2 mm or ZS 5385 mm guns that spoke in flat thunder. Facts replaced laughter. Visitors trace weld seams with their eyes and find the hexagonal turret's facets and the later cupola's vision blocks. Imagining periscopes fogging in winter, loaders' shoulders blackened by propellant, and drivers feeling the gearbox like a stubborn gate in the dark. Work lived inside the legend. Franz Halder's diary, 3 July 1941. Admitted the first fracture. We underestimated the enemy. A line as stark as a shell groove, while Heinz Guderian would later write, the T-34 was superior to our tanks, turning grudging field wisdom into doctrine. Testimony outlived excuses. At Kummersdorf in 1941-42, captured T-34s were stripped and prodded, engineers noting the sloped armour, wide tracks, and diesel safety, the pencils scratching toward a Panzer with similar angles that would be christened Panther. Imitation confessed respect. Across the ocean in 1943, Aberdeen Proving Ground ran a T-34 and a KV-1 hard and wrote sober praise for ballistic shaping and crossed country speed alongside blunt critiques of crude finish, punishing transmission and cramped turrets. Even admirers kept their eyes open. The T-34's line did not end where the Reichstag steps began. It ran forward through the T-44 into the T-454 4F-55, the V-2's descendants humming under new decks as the low, sloped philosophy became a world language. Design turned into inheritance. Numbers carried the weight of memory. Over 50,000 built by 1945, more than 80 Zalozend by the end of production, and each hull was a page in a ledger written with rail schedules, foundry heat, and names stenciled on turret rings. Mass became remembrance. Monuments keep watch where the war passed. T-3485s on stone plinths at Treptower Park in Berlin. A turreted silhouette on the fields of Prokhorovka. A once pink T-34 in Prague turned into argument, and art as years pulled the war into story. Steel learned to speak in public squares. Korean Hills in 1950 heard the old song again. T-34 IO-85s rolling through Osan against under-gunned defenders until heavier American armor. 3.5-inch rockets and air power answered with fire from above. The legend fought past its war. German recollections held the balanced verdict. Long 7.5 cm's guns, Tigers and Panthers clawed parity and then advantage at range, yet the shock of 1941-42 never quite left the mind. A memory of sparks skidding off a sloped nose that would not yield. First impressions bit deepest. Soviet memoirs added the other half. Crews wrestling stiff clutches and blind corners. Commanders doubled as gunners, until the 85 Amelia gave them a cupola and a voice, and brigades learning to fight in folds of ground, where range became a choice. Skill grew inside hardship. In museums the smell is preservative oil and dust, but if you lean close you can still imagine hot diesel and singed paint, the clang of a track pin, the faint grit of blown snow hitting steel at dusk. Echoes live in the senses. Documents close the story with neat edges. War pre-F6 reports recommending angled armour, Aberdeen notes on air cleaners and optics, field orders carved down to close to 300-600 metres, fire for effect, displace. Paper remembers what mud taught. The larger legacy sits beyond tonnage and test reports. An idea that a nation under pressure can turn steel speed, and enough into a decisive grammar for war, and that machines can become symbols heavy with both victory and grief. Myth carries a human cost. Somewhere in the birches east of Oral, the rain still falls on old roads and the ground keeps the shape of ruts where wide tracks once slid past the limits of expectation, leaving only the hush of cooling metal behind them. Time kept the lesson. The Wehrmacht thought the T-34 was a joke until it rolled through their lines.